Good afternoon. This is Public Service Committee. Call this committee meeting to order. First, review and approval of the minutes dated October 13th.
Move to approve, Urbanbach.
Second, Anderson.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Motion passes. First presentation we have today, Mr. Cooper, you're on a roll this afternoon. We'll be discussing the subdivision road access update with Mike Cooper and have additional speaking as well. Mr. Cooper, take it away.
Thank you. Mike Cooper, Planning and Building Services, and joining me today, Fire Marshal Dean Lanier, who's going to be the main presenter today. We've talked about subdivision access a couple of times with this committee, with other councilor members, and there's really kind of two areas of regulation that we can look at. One would be our city subdivision ordinance, and then the other one would be our fire code. Within our subdivision ordinance, which is separate from the zoning ordinance, we have some general guidelines as far as how streets are laid out and designed. In new subdivisions, the streets have to conform to our major street plan, which is a document that says typically every mile there's going to be an arterial street. We have collector streets, and then we have local streets. And that we have to make provisions for the continuation of existing streets through adjoining areas so that developer B cannot block the extension of a street into adjoining property. So they have to tie into the overall circulation plan. We typically want to see a collector street about every quarter mile. So the arterial streets are at every section line or every mile. Collector streets are roughly every quarter mile. And those connect the adjoining development areas. We want to make sure that the public can conveniently drive through neighborhoods so that if you have schools or parks or shopping areas, the land use in many cases is going to determine the layout of the streets and the connections between the various uses. So as we talked about, we have in some areas, we've got residential areas that have one major street that connects to them, and how can we improve on that in the future? And so Dean is going to step up here today and give you an update of where we're going with a revised fire code requirement that we're going to be taking forward for actual implementation. And so Dean, if you want to remind the committee of what we're working on and what the review process is going to be.
Dean Lanier, Division Chief Fire Marshal with Sioux Falls Fire Rescue. Since our prior meetings, we have been moving forward with having one-on-one discussions with several developers of many different types of development within the city. We haven't limited it to just a discussion with certain specific type of developers who may only do single-family homes. We've brought in several different developers who have had experience and knowledge about developing different types of developments within the city. Our discussion has been positive so far, and the feedback from them has given us some framework that we're going to go to IRAB committee next month in December and talk with them about. Our real goal here is to bring what had been policy, non-specific language outside of ordinance and bring it into ordinance within our code revision process for 2015. I'm sure within the past couple of weeks, Ron Bell has been here talking about the implementation of the 2015 IBC. I will be back talking about the implementation of the 2015 International Fire Code. And along with that, if we can make the timing work out, we will also have those provisions ready for subdevelopment access provisions and emergency access provisions for the fire code to be adopted as well. So that is what we've planned on so far, and hopefully that meets your expectations. Open for discussion if you want to engage and talk about what it is we're looking at, what kind of framework are we looking at bringing into the fire code so that the language is clear and distinct guidance for the developers as they move forward. We're always welcome to come back and have those discussions with you.
What we might suggest is for Dean to put together that information that we could get to the council at the same time that we go forward with the IRAB meeting, so that you have it ahead of time and you can have more opportunity to review it and to make comments on it. But really, as Dean said, it's a way of putting in ordinance some of the discussion that we've had in the past about when are these secondary roads going to be temporary, when are they going to be permanent, what's going to trigger that requirement. And that's what I know the concern has been as we've gone through these previous discussions. So I think we can put that proposal together and we can get it out to you prior to that IRAB meeting in December, if that would be appropriate.
Any questions, comments, anything from the committee? Kenny? Councilor Anderson? Sorry.
I guess, no, that's fine. I guess I want to say thank you. This is something that we've been looking at for almost a couple of years to see how we could change this to take care of that gap between when a temporary secondary access should become permanent, or there's a permanent secondary access to replace that temporary one. And I think this is a good step, so thank you very much for the work.
Councilor Urbanbach or Staggers, anything?
I would.
Councilor Urbanbach?
Just, this is a very general conversation, so I'm just trying to maybe fine tune it a little bit. Do you have ideas about, because that is our biggest thing, is the changing from gravel road or dirt road to something with some pavement on it. Can you give us some hints, maybe? Hints would be good. Let's start with that.
All right. So, broad spectrum. I can tell you that the conditions that led to the situations that are probably getting the most attention now, I don't believe we have a condition that can continue on from this point forward. So I think we've corrected the symptoms of the problem that had occurred in the past. Right now, through the planning process, up to a point in which a preliminary plan for subdevelopment to a construction plan for subdevelopment is done, there is constant interaction and engagement by fire prevention in the way the subdevelopment pieces together. So I don't think you're going to see that same condition play itself out in the future. So I can assure you that I will work very hard to make sure that 5 years from now we're not having the same discussion about another development within the city of Sioux Falls.
God help us, please.
So I'm committed to making that happen.
Okay.
The specifics about what we had in policy. This has been a carryover from 2007, I believe. So it spans back several different administrations for the Sioux Falls Fire Rescue. Basically what we had was within the subdevelopment provisions of the fire code, we had put in policy for emergency response temporary roads. Within that policy, the framework of that was that it had to meet some basic performance standards to be able to allow a fire truck to use it. And we would allow the usage of that temporary road for a number of 5 years until such point at which we would require the developer to pave that road. While in my research back, there's never been a time in which we've told a developer to pave a road. We never used that provision of that policy. So in talking with the subdevelopment community, our focus was on taking what was in the policy, moving that into ordinance, but building a framework where the pieces of the puzzle, as the subdevelopment builds out, has to work, has to be coordinated. We think we have some language in which the first phase of a development will lead to a second phase, will lead to a third phase, and we will know in advance, well in advance, to make sure that all the pieces come together and it's not isolated with a single point of access in and out and multiple homes being built on the property. So I think we have a good framework at this point moving forward. The question will be fine-tuning it and making sure that the rules of engagement are well articulated and understood by the development community.
So do I understand there's nothing in writing now? That's why,
There are provisions in fire code right now that
Right,
would
okay.
require our review and approval of the phased development. What we have not had, we only had this in policy, is how do we interweave that with the temporary access roads that are used for emergency vehicles? And at what point do we start talking about whether that temporary road ever needs to be paved? Is it a stopgap measure? What role and purpose does that temporary road serve? So our goal is to move that from a policy into ordinance with the review and approval of IRAB and the development community for your review.
okay. Then could I go beyond that and ask Mike, because when we started talking about this, and I'm just going to be open, when we were talking about Canterbury Heights, right? That's how we got on this conversation, right? When we were in the midst of that, one of the things that I heard from more than one person was, you know, there's only one way in and out of my subdivision too. And I would ask then about it, and it would always be, yeah, it's not a street that the residents can drive on, that it's something that's approved for fire trucks, but there is one in and out somehow. There's an emergency access. So I guess my question is, do we need to go back and revisit that? If people don't feel, if they feel maybe not unsafe, but they are just wondering, it's too big, isn't it? And the more words that come out of my mouth, the more I think, oh my gosh, I'm just opening a barrel of monkeys.
I understand what you're saying, because that's kind of,
Right? Because
Right.
these people are like, there's only one way in and out of where I live. But I asked, you know, either Public Works or the fire department, they can drive a fire truck in there because it's in through the back way and they take down the chain thing that's across the, you know, right?
So as Dean said, we have, looking back, we're kind of down to this one area that's been a problem. Going forward, another change that we've made is that we have different requirements for developers to bond for the required improvements.
Okay.
We're back prior to the recession, we did not do that. So if a road needs to be built, but the developer says, well, I'm not going to do it, or the developer's no longer there, we have a provision to put that in, which we did not have before. So
Right.
that makes a big difference. And then also, as Dean is saying, when you see that in writing, and we will put it in writing, that the phasing of developments, let's say you have a large subdivision that's going to have 5 different phases, and that second access isn't going to be available until maybe phase 3, potentially. So then what do you do in the meantime? Under phase 1 and phase 2, you end up getting a certain number of houses or lots developed. Then would that trigger this temporary secondary access? And then at what point would that trigger it to become permanent? That's the discussion that we've been having throughout this whole process, is how we work through that whole timeline of different scenarios. Now, if I'm not aware of too many existing developments, but there are some, that there's just one way in and one way out permanently, because there was a time that people wanted that. That was their preference. They like to live on these long cul-de-sacs because they were private, there was less traffic, and that was the preference. Well, now it's kind of gone the other way, that we want more connected developments, we want more options, and so that's what we're reviewing.
Well, and two, I think it was partly that conversation that we were having about school buses and,
Yes.
and all those kinds of things.
Yes.
People then suddenly were driving home going,
Yep.
oh, wait, I fit in that category. So it just was kind of a new awareness of.
But the
of-
Canterbury one is probably the most challenging one that we've had of those
right.
older developments that have been approved for quite some time.
Yeah.
I might have interrupted you, but you were gonna,
nope, that's fine.
Okay.
Counselor Anderson had a comment. Michelle, Counselor
good.
from back there.
Thank you.
Okay.
And also, just to add on to that, before we had the housing shortfall, we were developing in larger plots. So it was easier to add those second roads and that.
Yes.
And then after the housing shortfall, I think what happened is our developers started developing in a different method.
smaller
in
areas at a time.
Areas.
Yep.
That really didn't need a secondary road. So as our fire code says, after 30 homes, they have to provide a secondary temporary access. But then in the actual codes, it doesn't say when that access should become permanent or if there should be another permanent access to replace that temporary. And some of the fears were, and as we saw with Canterbury, and I think also with the, there was one that the council turned down here a few weeks ago on, what was that, 85th and Louise, the corner there where the development right behind it had 90 twin homes with what I call a driveway going in and out of it. And I know that once I drove out there and looked at that, I contacted Chief Lanier, and I've contacted him on several other locations, mostly along, you know, the southeast area, but where there's even larger single-family homes where there's only one road going in and out. There is an emergency access, but they're not being maintained or anything, so they grow over. And my fear was, and I explained that to Chief Lanier too, is that, you know, our first responders, our emergency people, they put their lives at risk every time there's a call. And when they get there, I don't want them to risk their lives trying to get there. So going over a muddy road, or, you know, driving a 100,000-pound vehicle on a undeveloped road, to me is not something that I'm willing to accept. So, you know, through our discussions and including Mike into this and planning, I think that, you know, we're moving ahead in the right direction now to correct some of the old problems. And then moving forward, I think that this will help working with the developers to come up with a new plan that matches their business plan also.
Any other comments? I'll have a couple. My two keys, I guess, for me, is in the beginning it was always, well, this is just a suggested plan, and we hear that, and I think that's where some of the residents have been frustrated, and so I'm excited to see the changes between at what trigger point do you have temporary versus permanent, and from getting that temporary access in there as well. I think those are the key things. My other question, which Mr. Cooper, you did answer, is what if they don't follow the requirement? And like you said, we have this bonded requirement now to where if somebody says, no thanks, I'm not doing it, sorry, I'm just not going to do it, you can say, well, yes, you are, and we have this bond on file, and that will take place. So those were my two key issues that were answered. So thank you for that. The other question that I guess I have is, are there other, I mean, we've certainly heard a lot about Canterbury because there's a development through them to get to the other developments. And so we've heard about them, but I'm curious if there's any others, or maybe we're just not hearing about them because they don't want to develop through them yet, or if there's others that still need to be addressed with that temporary versus permanent, and where we're at with those.
When we first came with a presentation about, I believe there were about 4 different developments that we wanted to bring to your attention. Canterbury Heights was one, Diamond Estates on the corner of 41st and it's in the southeastern portion of the city. There was another development off of Southeastern and 57th that we wanted to, Whispering Woods, and then Legacy Ridge is on West 22nd Street out off of T. Ellis Road. So those were the ones that we initially brought to your attention. I can tell you that those are correcting themselves. We do have continued development out there. There's more streets and more homes going in that's actually starting to link the developments together and get them to paved surfaces. So the growth that we're experiencing with the single-family, multifamily home construction is beginning to fix all of those problems. As I stated earlier, though, we have already put mechanisms in place that it is my commitment that it won't happen again. We won't continue to see isolated developments and phased developments occur over time.
Thank you. And I thank you both for working with us. I know that you have been in front of the Public Services Committee maybe 4 times now. And so I thank you on behalf of our committee for coming in front of us and keeping us up to date in those developments as well as the changes that you're making, and would encourage, as you have kind of the draft, to bring it forth to the committee just so we can weigh in, I think, a little bit. I think it's been a hot enough item and issue that I think that this committee and the council is probably pretty passionate about. So thank you. Any other questions? Any open discussion?
One last quick question. Mike, do we have any progress on Canterbury?
Yes, we have a new proposal that we'll be presenting at the new second reading next Tuesday for that
Thank you.
road.
Have the residents, I know that there's been some pretty vocal people involved.
I'm going to be meeting with at
Todd
least one
Miller.
or two of the residents either Thursday or Friday to give them an update. So yes, Mr. Miller will be one of the key people that I talk to.
I know he's kind of been their leader in the development, so I would encourage him to obviously be there. So thank you for the update. Any open discussion? All right. We do have a few more items coming up for public services over the next few months. If you have any items you'd like to bring forth, please let us and staff know, and we'll get them on the agenda. We'll adjourn this meeting.